Power rarely arrives in uniform. Sometimes it comes dressed as salvation, bearing rice and medicine, speaking the language of friendship. In 1979, when Vietnam's armies swept through the ruins of Cambodia, they promised liberation, an end to Pol Pot's nightmare. For a people starved and broken, the promise felt real. But as months turned to years, that promise began to change shape. Liberation slowly became supervision. Sovereignty turned into guidance. And behind every decision in Phnom Penh, there seemed to be another voice, quieter, foreign, and deliberate. This is the story of how Vietnam, through strategy and influence rather than conquest, reshaped Cambodia's political destiny. From 1979 to the early 1990s, Vietnamese advisors filled ministries, trained new leaders, and crafted a political order that would endure long after their troops withdrew. The war had ended, but control had not. In Cambodia, history's weight is never far away. Empires, revolutions, and invasions have all left their mark, but few shadows linger as deeply as Vietnam's. The unseen hand that rebuilt a nation, and in doing so, claimed a part of its soul. The morning light that broke over Phnom Penh in January 1979 did not feel like victory. It felt like survival. The city, abandoned for nearly 4 years under the Khmer Rouge, was a skeleton of its former self. Silent streets, burned-out cars, and walls still stained with the signs of execution. When the Vietnamese tanks rolled in, they found no resistance, only ghosts. Behind them came columns of soldiers and administrators carrying not just weapons, but blueprints, files, and flags. Cambodia was about to be rebuilt, but not entirely by Cambodians. To the outside world, the Vietnamese victory seemed decisive. Pol Pot's nightmare regime had fallen, and the killing fields had been silenced. Yet beneath the chaos of collapse, Hanoi's leaders had a plan far more intricate than mere rescue. They knew that to truly secure their western border, they needed more than soldiers. They needed control. And control would not come through occupation alone, it would come through politics. Within days, Vietnamese officials began organizing the remnants of Cambodian defectors who had fled Pol Pot's purges. These men, once low-ranking Khmer Rouge officers or local administrators, were desperate for survival and revenge. Among them was Heng Samrin, a quiet yet loyal figure who had crossed into Vietnam months earlier seeking refuge. Now he was called back, not as a fugitive, but as the chosen face of a new Cambodia. The People's Republic of Kampuchea was declared, its banner raised beside Vietnam's. The titles were Cambodian, the speeches were Cambodian, but the policies, and often the words themselves, came from Hanoi. Vietnamese advisors occupied nearly every ministry. They drafted decrees, supervised economic plans, and even edited public addresses before they reached the radio. The foreign hand was invisible to the untrained eye, yet it moved everything. To ordinary Cambodians, this presence was both comforting and unnerving. Vietnamese soldiers distributed rice and restored basic order. Schools reopened under their protection. Hospitals treated the malnourished and the maimed. For the first time in years, the sound of gunfire was distant, but the soldiers did not leave. They stayed in villages, guarded provincial offices, and built barracks near temples. Liberation began to look permanent. At the same time, Hanoi's strategy took shape behind closed doors. Vietnam had no desire to annex Cambodia outright. The world would never accept that. Instead, they sought to craft a dependent state, one bound by ideology and loyalty. Vietnamese advisors worked to rebuild the Cambodian People's Revolutionary Party, teaching its cadres Marxist-Leninist doctrine and Vietnamese administrative methods. Promising young Cambodians were sent across the border for training, courses that often lasted years, shaping a generation of politicians fluent not only in Vietnamese language, but in Vietnamese thinking. Phnom Penh became a city of contrasts. The rebuilt ministries buzzed with activity, but much of the decision-making flowed through Vietnamese translators. The Cambodian flag fluttered over Independence Monument, yet real independence was a matter of interpretation. In the streets, portraits of Ho Chi Minh appeared beside those of Cambodian leaders, a subtle reminder of who guided the new revolution. For a time, many accepted it. The Khmer Rouge had shattered the nation beyond recognition. Any structure, even one guided from Hanoi, was better than chaos. Farmers returned to the fields. Roads were repaired, the markets reopened, selling rice again instead of silence. Yet beneath the rhythm of recovery, unease stirred. Cambodia was alive, but whose heartbeat was it following? The Vietnamese influence extended deep into the machinery of governance. The new constitution, modeled after Vietnam's, defined the People's Republic of Kampuchea as a fraternal socialist state. Military operations were coordinated from joint commands, where Vietnamese officers held final authority. In the education system, textbooks praised Vietnam's heroism in saving Cambodia from reactionary genocide. Children grew up reciting songs about solidarity between the two nations, while adults quietly wondered when solidarity had become dependency. Even religion, once crushed under Pol Pot, returned in a form Hanoi could tolerate. Monks were allowed to resume their practice, but their sermons were monitored. Buddhism was welcome so long as it did not question the state. The temples filled again, yet behind the incense and chants lingered the knowledge that nothing in this new Cambodia was truly free from oversight. In the countryside, where memories of Khmer Rouge terror remained raw, Vietnamese troops were both protectors and occupiers. They built roads, distributed food, and hunted guerrillas. Yet their presence bred resentment. Farmers whispered of confiscated land, of officials who answered to foreign commanders. They spoke softly, for fear of being labeled ungrateful, but their silence was heavy with suspicion. Meanwhile, across the Thai border, the world watched and judged. To the United States, China, and their allies, Vietnam's intervention was an act of aggression, a Soviet-backed expansion under the guise of liberation. Cambodia's seat at the United Nations remained in the hands of Pol Pot's exiled regime, a cruel diplomatic farce that defied the suffering of its people. But politics was never about fairness, it was about leverage. And in this game, Cambodia was merely the board. Inside the Vietnamese political bureau, strategy continued with cold precision. Cambodia would be the younger brother, a socialist ally to serve as buffer against Chinese influence. Its government would mirror Hanoi's structure, ensuring loyalty even if the Vietnamese army eventually withdrew. Cultural programs and propaganda promoted shared struggle and mutual sacrifice. Yet the underlying message was always clear. Without Vietnam, Cambodia would fall again. For many Cambodians, that fear was convincing. Memories of Pol Pot's black uniformed killers were too fresh, too horrific. The Vietnamese might be controlling, but at least they were predictable. At least they brought food instead of death. That unspoken trade, freedom for safety, defined the next decade. In Phnom Penh, Vietnamese advisors became fixtures in ministries. Some were respected for their discipline and skill, others were despised for arrogance and interference. The Cambodian ministers themselves learned to navigate the delicate balance between appearance and obedience, how to smile for photographs while quietly submitting reports to their Vietnamese overseers. The politics of survival had replaced the politics of sovereignty. By the early 1980s, the system was complete. Cambodia functioned, but it was not independent. The People's Revolutionary Party controlled the country, and the party was controlled by those who owed their rise to Hanoi. The constitution, the army, the media, all bore the marks of Vietnamese influence. And yet, beneath the surface, something unexpected began to grow. Fatigue. Even among those who had once believed in socialist unity, whispers of frustration turned into quiet defiance. Ordinary people longed for a Cambodia that could stand on its own again. They wanted to speak without translation, to vote without guidance, to rebuild their culture without foreign approval. But the power lines that connected Phnom Penh to Hanoi were not easily severed. As the decade advanced and as the Cold War shifted, those lines would begin to fray. Yet for now, in the early years of occupation, the arrangement seemed unbreakable. A nation rescued from one nightmare had slipped quietly into another, one made not of terror, but of quiet control. Under the fluttering flags of friendship, Cambodia's future was being rewritten, not in the language of its people, but in the measured tones of those who had come once again from across the Mekong. Power no longer marched in boots. By the early 1980s, it wore civilian suits and carried pens instead of rifles. In Phnom Penh, the sound of gunfire had faded, replaced by the drone of meetings and the whisper of typewriters. Yet in every ministry, behind every office door, the quiet presence of Vietnamese advisors remained constant, unseen architects shaping Cambodia's rebirth in their own image. Vietnam's army still guarded the borders and patrolled the countryside, but Hanoi's real work was now political. The military had conquered Pol Pot's Cambodia. Now it was time to conquer its institutions. The People's Republic of Kampuchea had a constitution, a flag, and a national assembly. But these were the outer garments of sovereignty. The inner structure belonged to Hanoi. At the heart of this system stood the Kampuchean People's Revolutionary Party, the new ruling party crafted in Vietnam's mold. Its organization, slogans, and discipline mirrored the Communist Party of Vietnam down to the smallest detail. Its leaders, trained in Hanoi, had learned the art of loyalty disguised as autonomy. The message was simple: Cambodia's stability depended on Vietnam's guidance. Among these leaders, one figure began to rise: Hun Sen, a former Khmer Rouge commander who had defected to Vietnam and returned with its blessing. Intelligent, pragmatic, and fiercely ambitious, Hun Sen understood the delicate dance required to survive in a landscape ruled by foreign hands. He spoke of independence, but never defied his patrons. While Heng Samrin remained the symbolic head, it was Hun Sen who gradually became the true voice of the new Cambodia, a voice that could speak both to Hanoi and to his own people. Vietnam recognized his usefulness. In Hun Sen, they found a bridge, someone young enough to adapt, yet loyal enough to remain aligned. Step by step, Hanoi eased him upward. By 1985, he was Prime Minister, a post he would never relinquish. From then on, Cambodia's politics bore his imprint, shaped by the lessons of those years under Vietnamese mentorship. The system Hanoi built was efficient, but it was never free. Decisions on foreign policy, trade, and even education flowed through Vietnamese channels. The press praised unity, while dissent vanished into silence. Behind the curtains, Vietnamese advisors continued to review Cambodian documents, correct errors, and issue recommendations. Their influence was not imposed by violence, but by bureaucracy, a subtler, more permanent weapon. In the villages, the war still simmered. Guerrillas loyal to Pol Pot, Son San, and Sihanouk waged their insurgency from the Thai border, harassing Vietnamese and Cambodian troops alike. Entire provinces lived in fear of ambush. Mines tore limbs from farmers' children. Refugee camps overflowed with hunger and propaganda. Yet even as battles raged in the jungles, the capital's elite spoke of reconstruction and peace. It was as if two Cambodias existed at once, one bleeding, one rebuilding. Internationally, Vietnam's position grew difficult. Its occupation of Cambodia had isolated it from much of the world. China punished Hanoi with a brief but brutal war in 1979, while Western nations imposed diplomatic and economic isolation. the United Nations continued to recognize Pol Pot's exiled regime, a grotesque insult that revealed how politics valued power over justice. Still, Vietnam refused to retreat. It insisted that the People's Republic of Kampuchea was legitimate, that the friendship between the two nations was the only path to stability in Indochina. Inside Cambodia, that friendship was written everywhere, on posters, in textbooks, in songs sung by schoolchildren. "Vietnam saved us," the lyrics declared. "Vietnam and Cambodia, brothers forever." But beneath the surface, the tone shifted. Gratitude faded into fatigue. Vietnamese troops had stayed too long, and their presence had become a daily reminder of dependency. The 1980s dragged on under the weight of that contradiction. Hanoi's resources dwindled. The Soviet Union, its patron, was beginning to fracture under reform. In Phnom Penh, whispers of change grew louder. Hun Sen, ever the strategist, sensed that the world was turning. He began to speak softly of reconciliation, of the need for a political solution. While Hanoi held the reins, Hun Sen was learning how to loosen them. In 1986, Vietnam announced its policy of Joy Moi, renewal, reform, adaptation. The rigid socialism of the past began to yield to pragmatism. The same current reached Cambodia, where leaders now sought to mend relations with neighboring nations and re-enter the international stage. Behind the scenes, Vietnam and Cambodia's rulers negotiated ways to maintain control while appearing to liberalize. By the late 1980s, exhaustion overcame ideology. Vietnamese families wept for sons buried in Cambodian soil. Cambodian peasants prayed for peace that never came. Even the soldiers, hardened by years of patrols through the jungles, began to question what they were still fighting for. Hanoi faced pressure from all sides: economic crisis at home, diplomatic condemnation abroad, and internal doubts from within its ranks. The withdrawal began in silence. It was not celebrated, nor was it mourned. Convoys of trucks rumbled eastward through the dusty border crossings, carrying the last of the Vietnamese troops home. In 1989, after a decade of control, Vietnam's military presence in Cambodia officially ended. Phnom Penh's leaders declared sovereignty restored, but the strings of influence remained. Hun Sen, now firmly entrenched, steered the transition with careful precision. He presented himself as the architect of Cambodia's peace, the man who could bridge Vietnamese influence and international legitimacy. The government was renamed, symbols were changed, but the core structure, the one Vietnam had built, endured. Even as the United Nations arrived in the early 1990s to oversee elections and peace agreements, the foundations of power remained tied to that earlier decade of tutelage. Vietnam's control had changed form. It no longer needed soldiers or advisors. Its influence was encoded in Cambodia's political DNA, in the ruling party's organization, in its methods of control, in the survival instincts of the man who led it. The hidden hand had withdrawn from sight, but its imprint would never fade. In the years that followed, Cambodia's politics remained stable on the surface, turbulent beneath. Opposition parties rose and fell, protests were quelled, elections came and went, often under the shadow of intimidation. Each crisis seemed to echo the lessons of the 1980s: how to hold power quietly, how to rule by control disguised as order. Hun Sen's Cambodia was no longer Vietnam's satellite, but its creation had begun in the crucible of that dependence. By the turn of the millennium, the memories of occupation had blurred into history, yet distrust lingered. Cambodian nationalists still spoke of Vietnam's hidden influence, of land disputes, of subtle encroachment. Hanoi, for its part, moved carefully, offering trade, cooperation, and words of fraternity, all while keeping its interests secure. The two nations smiled for the cameras, but the Mekong still carried old suspicions in its muddy flow. In the end, Vietnam's control of Cambodia's politics was never about territory, it was about time. It planted seeds that would grow long after its armies had left. The lesson was not in conquest, but in patience, how to shape a nation through dependency, to mold its leaders, its institutions, even its fears. Liberation and control had become two faces of the same mask. Today, as the sun sets over Phnom Penh's skyline, a city reborn yet restless, the echoes of that era still resonate. Behind the skyscrapers and the slogans of independence, power still moves in familiar patterns. The system endures, smooth and unyielding, shaped decades ago under the watchful eyes of Vietnamese advisors who once believed they were saving a nation from itself. Cambodia's history remains caught between gratitude and resentment, between sovereignty and shadow. And Vietnam's hand, though hidden, still lingers. Not in the streets or the barracks, but in the very rhythm of how Cambodia governs itself. Was it liberation, partnership, or quiet domination? Perhaps it was all three. The answer, like the river between them, is murky, carrying reflections that change with every current. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history.